Okay, Erev Tov, everybody, and good to see a lot of familiar faces and not familiar faces. I'll dive right in because the time is very limited. We have very short time. Every year on the Pesach Seder, we say, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim." Right? Every year at the Seder, we have to imagine as if we were in Egypt, as if we were in Mitzrayim, and as if we were redeemed. I think, unfortunately, this year is going to be one of the easiest years to experience that. And as time has it, this was a difficult Mitzrayim-like kind of year, in the sense that we were threatened and oppressed by something that was beyond our control, something that we had no clue what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how it's going to turn out. And as fate would have it, or perhaps it was divinely ordained, finally we're seeing some sign of redemption, some sort of redemption. Finally, we're seeing vaccines, we're seeing people getting shot in their arms. People are talking about April, May, perhaps, to be able to go out. So it seems to me like, unfortunately, this is going to be a year where we will very easily have the experience of lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Imagine to a degree what it was like to be oppressed by something that's outside of your control, that's outside of your domain, and feels frightening and threatening and scary. And I've been saying throughout this pandemic, I've been saying and love to quote a statement from the rabbis in Tractate Nedarim. And it's quite an audacious statement from the rabbis. The rabbis say in Masechet Nedarim, I'll translate it in a moment, Ilimale chatu Yisrael be'egel, lo nitna lahem ela chamishei chimshei Torah v'sefer Yeshua bilvat. Let me translate. If it wasn't for the fact that the Jews worship the golden calf, we would have only had a very small Torah, the 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua. And the rabbis are saying something quite wild. It's almost like they're saying, thank God for the sin of the golden calf. Thank God for having to be in the desert for 40 years. The Torah became so expansive and so elaborate because of the golden calf, right? I mean, it's like almost like saying, oh, if it wasn't for that, we would not have been so fortunate. So obviously, nobody is saying that there's anything good about the pandemic. It's cost so many lives. It's made so many people ill. But at the same time, it has made us think and rethink aspects of halacha, aspects of Torah, aspects of Judaism that we otherwise would not have even begun to think. I mean, let alone when it comes to questions about Zoom and whether that's valid and other kind of questions. And I think our Pesach will also be much better understood given what we've experienced with the last year. So let me share with you quickly 1 or 2 interesting texts that I think would be very helpful in understanding what it is that we are expected to do this year in particular at the Seder night. So you might be familiar with this Mishnah. It's a very familiar Mishnah that in fact also shows up in our Haggadah, right? Rabban Gamliel ha'omer, Rabban Gamliel said, anybody who did not say these 3 things on Pesach, lo yatsa yadei chavato, did not fulfill their obligation. And these are the 3 things they have to talk about: Pesach, matzah, umaror. They have to talk about Pesach, matzah, maror. Shenemar va'amartem zevach Pesach hilashem. Right, so let's read the Mishnah inside. Rabbi Gamliel would say, anyone who did not say these 3 things on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation. You have to talk about a Paschal lamb, matzah, and the bitter herbs. When one mentions these matters, he must elaborate and explain them. Okay. Now, my question is twofold. First of all, why is it important to say these things? What's the importance about saying these things? That's number 1. And more importantly, the bigger question that I'm interested in, Rabban Gamliel says you did not fulfill the mitzvah? Which mitzvah did you not fulfill if you didn't talk about these three things? We don't have much time, but if anybody, one or two people want to suggest, when Rabban Gamliel says you did not fulfill the mitzvah unless you say these three things, which mitzvah did you not fulfill? Anybody want to make a suggestion? Tova, you have to unmute yourself. I guess people cannot unmute yourself. Okay, I guess people cannot unmute themselves. So let's go back to the text and I'll show you something fascinating. And it's really incredible. What's the proof text? What's the pasuk in the Torah that tells us that you have to say these things? The proof text is Shenemar va'amartem zevach pesach hi Hashem asher pasach al bnei Yisrael. Right? When you do the Korban Pesach, I want you to talk about the Korban Pesach. I think what we're seeing in this Mishnah is Rabban Gamliel's audacious response to the destruction of the temple. When there was a temple, the way to celebrate Pesach was you brought the Pesach offering. You brought the Korban. You went to the temple, you brought the Korban Pesach, and that's how you celebrated Korban Pesach. And then the Beis HaMikdash is suddenly destroyed. And with it, the Jewish community is devastated. No Beit HaMikdash, no temple, no Korban Pesach. What are we going to do? And Rabban Gamliel comes along and very audaciously reinterprets the purpose of the Korban Pesach. Rabban Gamliel tells the community, you got it all wrong. You thought the Korban is the end. You're going to the Beit HaMikdash because the end result is you should bring a Korban. And Rabban Gamliel said that's wrong. The Korban, the sacrifice, is a means. And you know what it's a means for? It's a means to prompt you to talk about your story. Shenemar, because it says, why do you bring a Korban Pesach? Va'amartem zevach Pesach hu Lashem. The purpose of the Korban is so that you can talk about the story. And that way, he basically kind of heals this community. The community feels there's no Korban Pesach, what am I going to do? And the answer is, well, we might not have the actual animal to sacrifice, but the main purpose of the Korban Pesach is to tell the story. And that we can continue to do. And I think that is the mitzvah of Pesach night. The mitzvah of Pesach night is to tell our story. In fact, I have an explicit biblical proof. Look what God tells Moses. Why am I redeeming the Jewish community? God tells Moses, for one reason only. Uleman tesaper. So that you can recount, so that you can tell a story. We were redeemed from Egypt so that we can tell the stories. Because that's what freedom is. A free person has a story. A free person has a narrative. A free person can tell what happened, what's going to happen, how dare it happened. And fascinatingly enough, God tells Moses, you know why I'm going to bring them out of Mitzrayim? Leman tesaper. And that's where Rabban Gamliel gets his idea that even though there is no Korban Pesach, even though we might not have the temple, we still have the storytelling part of Pesach. Because that is the purpose of Pesach. Pesach is to sit family, generations, and continue to develop their narrative. In fact, it's so fascinating to me because, once again, I'll bring up another verse. And I want to ask you to think about this verse because I left out one word. It says in the Torah, V'higadet ala bincha bayom hahu le'mor ba'avir zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. That's the Hebrew verse, and let's see the translation. And you, and I left out the one word, and you explain to your son on that day that it is because what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. Now, What's the word that's missing here? And you? And you what? Let me bring up the pasuk again and take a look and think, how would you fill in this verse? And you? I'll pause for 30 seconds so people can think, because there are two possibilities. Okay, so I see all of you have been very influenced by the rabbinic text. Whatever you wrote in the chat is incorrect, because if you read the text in the context, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. In the context, the Torah is telling us what will happen when we go into Egypt. You'll go into Egypt, you'll settle in the land, and by the way, this is what is going to happen. You will tell your children the story. The Torah is merely describing something that's going to happen. And the rabbis come along and tell us wrong. This pasuk is not descriptive. This pasuk is prescriptive. This pasuk becomes a mitzvah to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Right? And that's a fascinating read of a pasuk. I'm encouraging you tonight, after you get off these classes, take out the Chumash, read it with kind of unbiased eyes, and you'll see that the simple read of the pasuk is descriptive, and the rabbis turned it into something prescriptive to tell us that the purpose of tonight is to tell the story, which is, by the way, this is the only place that the rabbis are, I would say, obsessed to making sure everyone in the family participates, right? Keneget arba'a banim dibra Torah. There's 4 kind of ways of doing this. There was never, ever this kind of thing. There are no 4 ways of putting on tefillin. There are no 4 ways of keeping Shabbat. There are no 4 ways of, I don't know, any other mitzvah. This is the only mitzvah that I was given 4 options, because every child needs to be part of the family Jewish narrative. That's why the Torah was so adamant in providing options, in providing suggestions. You know, maybe with this child, this is how they're going to participate in the story. Maybe for that child, this is how they're going to participate in the story. Because we were redeemed from Egypt so that we have a narrative. In fact, when God gives us the first mitzvah, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm your God and I want you to listen to me. Why does he want us to listen to him? He could have said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Baraticha, I'm the God that created you. I created you and I get to say what you should do and what you shouldn't do. I get to command of you certain mitzvot. That's not what God says. Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzaticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the one who redeemed you from Egypt, made you a free people who has a free narrative, a free story to tell. And that brings me to my final point, which I think is a very important point. I'm sure many of you know the first Rashi in Parshat Bereshit, right? Rashi is baffled. Why is Rashi baffled? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, I will translate in a moment, Lo haya tzarich להתחיל את התורה, אלא מהחודש הזה לכם, שהיא מצווה ראשונה, שנצטוו בה ישראל, ומה הטעם פתח בבראשית. Let me translate. Rashi is baffled. Rashi says, the purpose of the Torah is to tell us what to do. The purpose of the Torah is to tell us the mitzvot. Why is that not the opening shot? Why is that not the opening beginning of the Torah? Here is mitzvah number 1. Here is mitzvah number 2. Here is mitzvah number 3. And Rashi has an answer. Rashi has a whole solution to the problem. I think Rashi's problem makes a certain assumption about the relationship between the narrational part of the Torah and the commandment part of the Torah. Which is means and which is end. Which is where and purpose for what. Rashi assumes that the framing in the beginning of the book of the 5 books of the Torah, Bereshit, Shemot, Bamidbar, those are means towards an end, and the end is observance. Which is why Rashi asks us the question, if the primary purpose of the Torah was observance, shouldn't that be the opening salvo? Shouldn't that be with what we begin? And I would like to suggest perhaps the answer to Rashi's question is that it's the other way around. That this is evidence that it's the other way around. The Torah is there to help us have a narrative, help us be able to tell a story that goes back all the way to the beginning. Why am I here? What am I doing here? Well, here is how the story starts. This is what happened a couple of years later, and this is what happened a couple of years later, etc., etc., etc. And what is the role of the mitzvot in there? They create an environment in which a narrative is possible to grow and thrive. The mitzvot are the means, the story is the end. And that answers Rashi's question. You know why the Torah starts with a narrative? Because that's the primary purpose. We were here to be people who have a story. That's our heritage. That's what we pass on to our children. That's what we pass on to our grandchildren. And that's the kickoff of what the Torah. In the middle, there are some recipes. Those recipes are called mitzvot, right? The Zohar calls mitzvot itin, eitzot. They are suggestions for us to live a life in which a healthy, rich, vibrant narrative can grow. And I think that's the story, that's the mitzvah that we are going to fulfill on Friday night. On Friday night, when we sit down to the Seder, the little silver lining in this terrible, terrible tragedy of the pandemic is that we will all going to have a significant story to tell this year and next year and next year. And however many people are in this room, that's however many stories will be told this Friday night. And this is our charge this Friday night, to sit back with whoever we're going to spend the Seder. As we know, some people now have gotten notes from the doctors they can hug their grandchildren, perhaps spend the Seder night with their grandchildren, and let's sit back for 2 minutes, for 10 minutes, and think, how does this pandemic fit into our larger Jewish narrative? It's too soon to have concrete answers. It will take a lot of time to kind of develop it, but I have no doubt this will be part of our narrative next year and the year later and the year later and the year later. But this is the beginning of what needs to happen this Friday night. We were redeemed, leman tesaper, so that you have a story. Vehigadata labincha, you shall tell your children, not you will tell your children. And that's what Rabban Gamliel says. Kol shelo amar shlosha devarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chavato. And that's very aggressive language, I would say. That's very emphatic language, because we get sidetracked by all the other things on the Pesach night, right? We get sidetracked by the other things, which are important, of course. Kiddush is important, and make sure you have the sheer kazayat for your matzot, you have the right sheer for the maror, and you have the right pillow and the appropriate Haggadah. But remember, really tonight, Friday night, is about telling your story to yourselves. We need to have our own story, telling the story to your loved ones, and telling the story to those who need to continue that chain and that narrative. Leman tesaper ba'aznei bincha uven bincha eis asher etzalalti b'Mitzrayim, because as I said, a free people have a narrative. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. You know what gives God the right to make demands on us? Because Asher Hotzeiticha Ma'eretz Mitzrayim. And I will end with a beautiful quote from Robert Cover, a very famous philosopher of law. And here's where he writes, and with that I'll end. And you'll be able to get the quote later. And with that I'll finish. We inhabit a normative universe. It's all about laws and halachot and all of that. We constantly create and maintain a world of right and wrong, of lawful and unlawful, of valid and void. The student of law may come to identify the normative world with the professional paraphernalia of social control. They think the purpose of rules is to control society. The rules and principles of justice, the formal institutions of the law, and the conventions of a social order are indeed important to that world. That's true. Law is so that the world can function. They are, however, but a small part of the normative universe that ought to claim our attention. Very powerful words. Mitzvot are there, yes, in order to live the right life, but they have an even more important goal. No set of legal institutions or prescriptions exists apart from the narratives that locate it and give it meaning. These are very powerful words. Why do I put on tefillin? Here is the story. Why do I keep Shabbat? Here is the story. Why did I struggle with my faith there in the pandemic? Here is the story. For every constitution, there is an epic. For each decalogue, there is a scripture. I could not have said it better and more emphatically. I hope that this Pesach you really enjoy telling your story, and your story is only yours, and hopefully each and every one of us can find a sliver of a silver lining in this terrible, terrible tragedy that will make our story richer, thicker, and more elaborate. Chag kasher v'sameach, everybody, and thank you very, very much.